In the autumn of 1290, every Jew in England was given a choice that was not really a choice at all: leave the kingdom within 3 months or face execution. King Edward I had signed the Edict of Expulsion, forcing 16,000 people to abandon homes, businesses and debts owed to them by Christian neighbors who suddenly had every incentive to see them gone. What had enabled this small population to become so economically indispensable that their removal required a royal decree? And what would allow their descendants to rebuild influence again and again across 1,000 years of displacement? The answer begins not with wealth or conspiracy, but with a book and a set of obligations that turned literacy into survival. For over 2 millennia, Jewish law required every father to teach his son to read. Not just the wealthy, not just the priestly class, but every father. This was not a cultural preference. It was a commandment embedded in the Torah itself, tied to daily prayer and the public reading of scripture in every synagogue each week. By the year 800, when most of Christian Europe was illiterate and even many kings could not write their own names, Jewish communities from Cordoba to Cairo had near universal male literacy because religious participation demanded it. A man who could not read, could not fully pray, could not study the Talmud, could not participate in the legal disputes that governed daily life. The synagogue was not just a house of worship, it was a courtroom, a school, and a library. This educational structure created an unintended economic advantage. In the medieval world, literacy meant access to contracts, international correspondence, and record-keeping. Jewish merchants could trade across vast distances because they could write letters in Hebrew to co-religionists in other cities, extending credit and trust through a shared legal system that transcended borders. When a Jewish trader in Venice wanted to do business in Alexandria, he did not need to rely solely on personal reputation. He could send a letter to the synagogue where elders would verify the standing of his correspondent. This network was not formal or centralized. It was organic, built on the infrastructure of religious life, and it made Jewish families vital to the emerging commercial economy of the medieval Mediterranean. If you are starting to see the pattern behind the power, then you are exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. We dig past the myths and the conspiracies to show you what actually happened in Jewish history, using documents, letters, and records that reveal the human decisions behind the big outcomes. Subscribe now so you do not miss the rest of the story, because what happens next changes everything. But literacy alone does not explain why Jewish families accumulated capital. For that, you need to understand the trap that Christian theology set for European economies. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had hardened its stance on usury, defining any loan with interest as a mortal sin. This was not a minor prohibition. It was enforced through confession, excommunication, and the threat of eternal damnation. Christian merchants could lend money, but only at 0 interest, which meant they had little incentive to loan to strangers or for long durations. Economies grew anyway, and with growth came demand for credit. Farmers needed seed money, nobles needed cash to pay armies, builders needed advances to construct cathedrals. Enter the Jews, who were prohibited from owning land in most of Europe, barred from guilds that controlled craft trades, and excluded from most occupations except commerce and medicine. Lending money was one of the few economic niches left open, and Jewish law permitted charging interest to non-Jews. This was not a privilege, it was a trap with a delayed fuse. Jewish lenders became essential to Christian kingdoms, but they also became visible and resented. When a peasant owed money to a Jewish creditor, the debt was not an abstraction. It was a person, identifiable by dress and residence, often living in a segregated quarter. Defaults turned into anger, anger turned into violence. And when kings needed a political win or a financial reset, expelling the Jews wiped out debts owed to them while allowing the crown to seize their property. England in 1290 was only the beginning. France expelled its Jews in 1306, then again in 1394. Spain in 1392 forced out the largest and most established Jewish community in Europe. Each expulsion followed the same logic. Let them grow indispensable, let resentment build, then take everything and start over. But here is the twist that almost no one expects. Each expulsion scattered families into new regions, and those families carried with them the same tools that had made them valuable in the first place: literacy, legal knowledge, and international networks. When Spanish Jews fled in 1492, many went to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II welcomed them explicitly because of their skills. Others went to Amsterdam, where they helped build the Dutch commercial empire. A smaller number went to Poland and Lithuania, where kings granted them charters to manage estates, collect taxes, and run taverns. Within 2 generations, the displaced had re-established themselves, often in positions nearly identical to the ones they had lost. The pattern repeated because the underlying structure had not changed. Jews were mobile, educated, and organized through religious institutions that doubled as economic networks. Now jump forward to the 18th century, when a new force entered European Jewish life, one that would fracture old certainties and create the conditions for unprecedented upward mobility. The Enlightenment arrived with a promise. If you abandon your old particularities, if you learn the language of the state, adopt its dress, and participate in its culture, you can become a citizen. This was revolutionary. For 1,000 years, Jews had been subjects tolerated but never equal. Now, in Prussia, France, and Austria, governments began debating Jewish emancipation. The catch was assimilation. Moses Mendelssohn, the Berlin philosopher who became the face of Jewish enlightenment, argued that Jews could be both loyal Germans and observant Jews, that religious identity and civic identity need not conflict. He translated the Torah into German and wrote defenses of rationalism that won him the respect of Christian intellectuals. But his own children converted to Christianity. This was not coincidence. The choice facing Jewish families was brutal. Hold on to tradition and remain second class, or integrate and risk losing your children to the majority culture. Emancipation arrived unevenly. France granted Jews full citizenship in 1791, in the wake of the Revolution. German states followed slowly, grudgingly, often reversing rights after political backlashes. Russia never emancipated its Jews at all. Instead, it confined them to the Pale of Settlement, a border region, where they could live but not leave without permits. The Russian Empire in the 19th century contained the largest Jewish population in the world, over 5 million people by 1900, and it treated them as a problem to be managed. Quotas limited university admission. Laws banned Jews from owning land. Pogroms, often tolerated or encouraged by local authorities, burned villages and killed thousands. Yet within this Yarport pressure cooker, something unexpected happened. Jewish families doubled down on education, seeing it as the only lever they could control. Yeshivas trained boys in Talmudic reasoning, which built skills in logic, argumentation, and textual analysis. Secular schools, when accessible, were flooded with Jewish applicants who outperformed quotas designed to limit them. By the late 19th century, Jews made up less than 5% of the Russian Empire's population, but more than 10% of university students in cities where they were allowed. In Vienna, a third of students in the medical and law faculties were Jewish. In Budapest, half the journalists were Jewish. This was not because of wealth. Most Jewish families in Eastern Europe were poor, working as tailors, peddlers, or laborers. It was because education was the only inheritance that could not be confiscated. When a pogrom destroyed your home, you could rebuild if you had skills. When borders changed and you had to flee, you could find work if you had a profession. This calculus, repeated across millions of families, created a statistical anomaly, a population with far higher rates of literacy, professional training, and geographic mobility than the surrounding societies. And then came the migrations. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe for the United States. They arrived with almost nothing. The average immigrant had less than $20. They crowded into tenements on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in neighborhoods so dense that tuberculosis was called the Jewish disease. They worked in garment factories where the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911 killed 146 workers. Most of them young Jewish women locked inside by managers afraid of theft. But they also did something that distinguished them from nearly every other immigrant group. They kept their children in school. Irish and Italian immigrants in the same tenements pulled their kids out of school at 14 to work and contribute to family income. Jewish families, even those surviving on pennies, sacrificed present earnings for future credentials. By the 1930s, the children of those immigrants were entering law schools, medical schools, and City College of New York, which became known as the Harvard of the proletariat because it was free and filled with the children of garment workers. This is the hinge moment that explains the next century. Education was not just a Jewish value in some abstract sense. It was a strategy refined over generations of instability that said invest in the child's mind because everything else can be taken. When the Great Depression hit and a third of Americans were unemployed, Jewish families with professional degrees weathered the storm better than those without. When World War II ended and the GI Bill opened universities to millions, Jewish veterans used it at higher rates than the national average. By 1970, Jews made up 3% of the American population, but nearly 20% of Ivy League students. This was not the result of conspiracy or favoritism. It was the compounding return on a multi-generational bet on education made under conditions of existential uncertainty. Now consider what was happening in Europe at the same time. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. It targeted the educated as aggressively as it targeted the poor. Rabbis, doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists, entire intellectual communities were erased. The Nazis did not just kill people, they destroyed centuries of accumulated cultural capital. The Vilna Ghetto, once called the Jerusalem of Lithuania for its scholars, was liquidated. The Jewish quarter of Warsaw, which had produced Nobel laureates and Yiddish poets, was razed. And yet, in the aftermath, survivors did exactly what their ancestors had done after the expulsions of the Middle Ages. They rebuilt. Displaced persons camps in Germany became temporary cities where survivors organized schools, theaters, and newspapers in Yiddish and Hebrew. Refugees who reached Israel or the United States or Australia started over with nothing but the knowledge in their heads. Israel itself is the most extreme case study in this pattern. In 1948, the new state had a population of 600,000, most of them poor, many of them refugees. It was surrounded by hostile armies and had almost no natural resources. Within 30 years, it had compulsory military service, a thriving tech sector, and universities that produced research at rates comparable to much larger countries. The explanation is not genetic, it is institutional. Israel's founders, many of them socialist Zionists from Eastern Europe, built a state that prioritized education and scientific research as tools of survival. They invited Jewish scientists fleeing Europe and the Soviet Union, offering them labs and funding. They created the Technion and Hebrew University as research centers that could convert brainpower into patents, agriculture techniques, and military technology. By the 1990s, Israel had more startups per capita than any country except the United States. This was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate policy choices made by people who understood that in a small country with hostile neighbors, human capital was the only renewable resource. But return now to the question of power, because education and professional success do not automatically translate into political influence. For that, you need organization, access, and the ability to mobilize resources across communities. Jewish families and institutions developed these capabilities out of necessity because they were almost always minorities operating in political systems where they had no guaranteed protection. Synagogues were not just religious centers. They were mutual aid societies offering loans, arbitrating disputes, and supporting widows and orphans. In Eastern Europe, the Kehillah, or Jewish Community Council, collected taxes, ran schools, and managed relations with local authorities. These institutions created a habit of collective action and internal governance that persisted even after emancipation and migration. In the United States, this habit expressed itself through the creation of national organizations. The American Jewish Committee, founded in 1906, lobbied against immigration restrictions and fought legal discrimination. The Anti-Defamation League, founded in 1913, tracked and countered anti-Semitic propaganda. These groups were not populist. They were led by wealthy, assimilated Jews who saw themselves as protectors of their less fortunate co-religionists. But they were effective because they understood how American power worked through courts, media, and backroom negotiations. When Leo Frank, a Jewish factory manager in Atlanta, was falsely accused of murder in 1913 and later lynched by a mob, Jewish organizations responded by building legal defense funds and funding civil rights work that would later benefit other minorities. This same organizational capacity appeared in other domains. In Hollywood, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe built the major studios. They were not moguls when they arrived. They were furriers, glove makers, and scrap metal dealers who saw opportunity in the new technology of motion pictures. Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal, started as a clothing store manager. Louis B. Mayer sold scrap metal. William Fox ran a penny arcade. They built an industry that defined global culture for a century, and they did it by working together, hiring each other, and taking risks that established firms would not. This was not nepotism in the pejorative sense. It was the same network strategy that had allowed medieval Jewish merchants to trade across borders, trust built on shared identity, mutual obligation, and the knowledge that outsiders had to work harder to succeed. By the mid-20th century, this combination of education, organization, and network effects had created visible Jewish presence in fields far beyond commerce: science, law, medicine, entertainment, journalism, academia. In 1905, Albert Einstein published the theory of special relativity. In 1922, Niels Bohr, whose mother was Jewish, won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Between 1901 and 2023, Jews won over 20% of all Nobel Prizes, despite being less than 0.2% of the world's population. This is not a small statistical blip. It is a pattern that demands explanation, and the explanation is not mystery. It is the compounding effect of literacy, educational investment, urban concentration, and selection pressures that rewarded intellectual achievement, because physical safety and land ownership were unavailable. Yet this success carried its own dangers. Visibility bred resentment. In the 1920s and 30s, European fascists and American anti-Semites pointed to Jewish overrepresentation in finance, media, and academia as evidence of conspiracy. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fraudulent document fabricated by the Russian secret police, purported to reveal a Jewish plan for world domination. It was exposed as a hoax almost immediately, but it spread anyway, translated into dozens of languages, cited by Henry Ford in his newspaper, and used by the Nazis as justification for genocide. The accusation of excessive power became the pretext for annihilation. After the Holocaust, Jewish communities faced a paradox. They had been nearly destroyed for being too successful. Yet the survivors rebuilt using the same strategies that had made them targets. In the United States, Jewish families continued to prioritize education, and by the 1960s, Jewish students were so overrepresented at elite universities that some schools quietly imposed quotas to limit their numbers. Yale, Princeton, and Harvard all restricted Jewish admission through subjective criteria like character and leadership, the same tools that would later be scrutinized in affirmative action debates. These quotas were eventually dismantled, but their existence reveals the tension. A minority group that thrives through merit will eventually threaten the established majority, which will then change the rules. The establishment of Israel added a new dimension. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews had sovereign power, an army and control over territory. This changed the nature of Jewish political influence globally. Diaspora communities, especially in the United States, organized to support Israel through lobbying groups like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. AIPAC became one of the most effective advocacy organizations in Washington, not because it was the wealthiest, but because it was disciplined, bipartisan, and focused. It educated lawmakers, mobilized voters, and built coalitions with Christian evangelicals who supported Israel for theological reasons. Critics called it evidence of dual loyalty. Supporters called it democracy in action. Both were partially correct. What is undeniable is that Jewish political influence in the United States, as in other democracies, derives not from shadowy control but from transparent participation, high voter turnout, campaign donations, policy expertise, and coalition building. Jews vote at higher rates than the general population. They donate to political campaigns across the spectrum. They work in government, media, and think tanks. This is not unique to Jews. It is what successful minorities do in pluralistic democracies. What makes it seem disproportionate is the small base population. When 3% of the country provides 10% of the donations or 15% of the opinion columnists, it stands out. But the mechanism is not a cult. It is organizational skill applied to democratic systems. The question of power, then, is inseparable from the question of survival. Jewish families became powerful not because they sought power for its own sake, but because they needed tools to navigate a world that repeatedly turned hostile. Literacy was a religious obligation that became an economic asset. Networks were a byproduct of diaspora and religious community. Education was an inheritance that could not be seized. Political organization was a defense against persecution. Each of these adaptations made sense in isolation, but together, across centuries, they created a feedback loop. Success increased visibility, visibility increased risk, and risk reinforced the behaviors that drove success. This is the lesson that extends beyond any single community. The structures that create resilience in one generation can create vulnerability in the next. The same skills that allow a minority to thrive can make it a target, and the strategies that work under persecution do not disappear when persecution ends. They become culture passed down as wisdom, even when the original danger has faded. Jewish families are powerful today not because of ancient secrets or modern conspiracies, but because they inherited a toolkit built over 2,000 years of instability, and they never stopped using it. That toolkit included a book that required every child to read, a legal system that worked across borders, a willingness to move when necessary, and a conviction that the mind was the only wealth that could not be confiscated. Those choices made by millions of individuals across centuries compound into the patterns we see today. The power is real, but it is not mysterious. It is the sum of decisions made under pressure, refined through repetition, and transmitted through families who understood that the world could change overnight, and the only preparation was to be ready to build again.